Welcome to Witham Sounding Board, a podcast sharing powerful business tips, insights, and trends for those seeking to become a rock star in their industry.
Hello, welcome to episode 2 in our series on healthcare M&A, and excited to have the audience back to hear further insights into this topic. I'm Steve Brady, partner with Witham and market leader of our transaction advisory practice, and certainly working a lot with our healthcare providers and private equity clients in this space.
Thank you, Steve. And I'm Sydney Welch and happy to be here talking with you again on this subject. I'm a partner with the healthcare practice of Bradley, Arant, Bolton, Cummings, representing physician specialty practitioners and investors in healthcare. It's a pleasure to be here today and talk a little bit about what can go wrong with deals. And of course, the answer is nothing ever, particularly if you prepare the best that you can. But it raises the really great question, I think, looking behind the curtain for these deals with physician practices and private equity investments in terms of how can that deal get hung up? Steve, you got some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do. I mean, as you said, there's certainly many ways they can get hung up. And, let me start with talking about valuation. And I think that, certainly working with excellent experienced advisors, experienced in the industry and the specialty that you operate in is really important. And by advisors, certainly on the legal side, financial side, or an investment banker if representing you. And my point on that, valuation seems like an easy place to start, but a lot of times just setting expectations. I know my friend in a different specialty sold their practice for X dollars, and the expectation becomes that's the dollar amount that you and your practice should be able to sell for. And it's much more complicated than that. And certainly, as we covered in episode 1, understanding the financial aspects of your practice and how a buyer is going to look at that, how that ties to this one issue on valuation is many times, again, if you go through what we talked about last time, the billing and collection rates, and if there's issues, that's going to give pause to the buyer and likely lead to trying to trade on the valuation, because if things are going in the wrong direction, what they expected when they entered into an LOI may not be the reality they're seeing. So, it can impact their view on valuation. And valuation is always a tough discussion, as, Sydney can certainly add some more meat to that bone in a minute, as she's the one on the front lines with the negotiations. But, as you go through diligence and issues are found, what expectations are at the LOI stage many times change, and so certainly one of the big reasons that causes deals to stall or have a hard time getting done. The second one I want to talk about, and I think it seems like this actually is more common, at least in causing angst and trying to get a deal done, because hopefully the expectations on valuation can be met. But, employment terms, and something that is really important to understand before you embark on a process, because I know certainly I've seen more times than I would ever want to see where it was the actual key nuts and bolts of the employment contracts that got in the way of a physician or a physician group wanting to proceed with a deal. And again, I'll turn it to Sydney in a moment to add some more specifics, as she's the one who negotiates those agreements. And then finally, it's just understanding that there's give and take in the deal. And as you're negotiating the agreement, there's money on the table and money at stake, but there's also control of the future business. If you're selling to a private equity firm and you're a platform business for them to grow an enterprise off of, it's really important that you are aligning yourself with a partner, and a partner from a financial side who's going to help and work with you to grow the practice. As we talked about last time, those growth opportunities are critical. But with that, who's going to control some of the key decisions, and what is the makeup of the board and the governance structure and the management team going forward? So there's always that give and take in some of these negotiations between money and control. So again, Sydney, a lot of your view from the negotiating table on these topics and others.
Yeah, these are some key points that can hang up a deal. And so it's important to know those things going in. Just to add and highlight a couple of things that Steve said from a different vantage point from the legal side of things, for valuations, healthcare is different. So all the normal operating rules for business take a little bit of a twist to them because of the regulatory framework that we find ourselves in. And so it's not a one size fits all, as Steve mentioned, where you can compare apples and oranges and tack a same valuation number on it. You have to start with a qualified healthcare evaluator that has experience in evaluating these types of deals because of the regulatory problems on both sides of the equation if you don't have an accurate, informed valuation. And that also requires a flow of information and sometimes education to make sure the evaluator has all the pieces and the information that can cause the value of a practice to go up. So there is an important role that the physicians play in that. The practice plays in it just as much as the evaluator. So the physician practices should not view this as hitting the lottery and the sky's the limit in terms of what they can be paid for the deal, but rather it will have those bumper and safeguards, and it's nobody's fault. It's just what the valuation says, and that's the evidence that will cause the government to raise an eyebrow or be okay with a particular transaction. I think the other expectations similarly for employment agreements is it's not going to look like your normal physician practice employment agreement. They're going to be different. And there are some things that go into that last point in terms of money and control that will vary and look a little bit different. There should not be the expectation that your benefits are going to include, for example, a parking space. It's not going to get down to that level of minutia or perks in terms of things that may be important to the physician practice group and the leaders. And so they should have an understanding of what are priorities for them, because if it's not aligned, then the deal's going to have some hardships, and you never want it to get hung up on the employment agreement. And so from, a give and take perspective, the practice is giving up things and giving up autonomy and freedom that it's used to, because the end game again on these deals is to capitalize and increase the value. In order to do that, you have to a certain extent decrease cost and be more efficient about how you do things. But you're going to see typical things like non-competes that may be as far as statewide. And that is a very strange concept for physicians. But to get that payout and to get the deal done, that may be a non-negotiable term from the perspective of the private equity firm.
Yeah, those are all great points. And as we talk about, how the deal can get hung up, Sydney, let's cover some, what things should you do, what things shouldn't you do as you're working through a deal and trying to get that deal done.
Yeah, I think from a blessing perspective, it's not usually the regulatory issues that are hanging up the deal in all of this. Really, we view it from a legal perspective as an allocation of risk, meaning that the documents that get executed with the deal are going to determine how things shake out, and can they be papered in a way that makes sense for the risk of all of that. But that being said, you certainly should have your house in order as you're going to explore a deal with a private equity firm. And to have your house in order, there are some dues that you want to take into account there. You want to have some internal conversations at the practice level, with the practice group leaders about what the expectations and the why of doing a deal, to make sure that everybody's going to have the stick-to-itness that it's going to be necessary to get the deal to conclusion. And there also needs to be conversations that take place with the private equity investment firm as to what their expectations are, to make sure really the goals are aligned, because if this does work well on a going forward basis, it will necessarily be a collaboration. It has to be, because physicians are the only person that can deliver the clinical services. And in turn, the private equity firms are bringing the running of the business, which so many physicians actually are looking forward to. But it has to be a partnership in terms of making that run efficiently. There should be a process on interviewing multiple investment bankers and making a decision. And it's not just pardon the expression, it's not just the Bubba factor of who your friend used. That's an important factor in the consideration. But other things like what are the other options that are out there in the marketplace, and retaining your own broker to help you evaluate really what those opportunities for. And what the pluses and minuses of each one are. And then we've already talked about the numbers and the finance aspects of it, but making sure that you have those numbers clear and squared away and presented in a way that makes sense, but are efficient and accurate, so that you know what your numbers are going into the deal beyond in terms of what the private equity and firm is going to be looking for. So what we say to clients is don't take that kind of, rifle fish in a barrel approach and scatter the buckshot, because that will devalue yourself if you've gone to the marketplace in not a prepared way. Also, the non-disclosure agreements and the LOIs are heavily negotiated, and you should make sure before that back and forth dialogue happens with anybody that those are put in place and that those get reviewed by counsel, because they can contain some binding terms that can limit what your options are. So just like the private equity firm is going to be doing its diligence on the physician practice, it'll be super important for the practice to do its own diligence on the potential investor. And everybody involved in the game has to be realistic about what the timing expectations are. It is so totally not unlike building a house, right? Where they tell you it's always twice the expense and twice the amount of time. It's a pretty good rule of thumb for doing these types of transactions. So I think also important are setting expectations, which we've talked a lot about, to make sure that the deal doesn't get hung up, but making sure that everybody involved knows what will change after the deal is done. And Stephen, your observations, what are the most important things to communicate about that for both sides?
Yeah, that's a great question, Sydney, and certainly the physicians entering into a transaction, the more they can understand what these areas are early on, and then not get surprised as it gets closer to the closing date and maybe get a little seller's remorse. I think it's really important that they appreciate and understand these so that the whole deal can be successful. As you said a little while ago, the objective here is to obviously get a deal done, and that's what we're talking about, but also that post-deal, it's a successful operation for the private equity firm, the investor, and the physicians. And to do that, operations have to run real smooth. So I think, the first answer to the question is certainly there will be an impact on operations. Obviously, the physicians are responsible for all the medical care, and that doesn't change, and that is obviously their authority. But things in operations, like it could be how the business is staffed, how you order inventory, again, if you're stocking drugs because of your specialty, impact on operations in terms of bringing a CFO in-house perhaps, or measuring the point in time that you need to have that level of expertise. And again, from an operations standpoint, it can also be, again, going back to the billing cycle and understanding better ways to, from the front desk to collecting that money in that whole process. There's certainly going to be a lot of attention there. And so again, overall an impact on operations, and it touches a number of different and important non-medical aspects of the practice. The second thing you got to understand, and it's going to be different. We were just talking a little while ago about those employment contracts, and you're going to need to operate under those employment contracts. You have new partners, and you're going to be responsible to them. So it's really important to understand that it's not your practice, and obviously they don't all operate this way, but it's not your practice where you can make the decisions, and there's going to be criteria in those employment contracts like time off that you need to factor in. I think bigger and more strategic as you look at what this will look like after a deal. Again, major decisions before a transaction are made by a group of doctors, the entire physician group, or a single doctor, depending on the practice and how the practice is operated historically. But now going forward, there's going to be a board of directors. Obviously, going to have representation on that board, but it's that board that is going to be meeting regularly, making major decisions, and understanding that governance structure and really operating within, on the one hand, those confines, but really the purpose obviously is that is a facilitation of growing this practice and again making the deal successful for everybody afterwards. But it's going to be different. It's going to be different than how you operated before the deal. And then I guess the final thing I mentioned, Sydney, and turn it over to you for some final thoughts. But, again, as we've said on this episode and the prior episode, you need to grow the practice, making this deal, again, successful for everyone after the transaction. A lot of times that's going to involve acquisitions, add-on acquisitions, as we call them, of smaller practices. And again, whether that's geographically expanding or adding specialties or just adding within your existing geographic footprint, doctors that are high quality and fit the culture and the medical stature of your practice. That's going to take time. And it is going to be, something that probably has not been done historically, and you'll be needing to pay attention to expanding the practice and other avenues than acquisitions too. But, there's certainly other ways to do it, again, in terms of adding additional capabilities or specialties, or depending on the practice, again, more clinical trial activity. There's a lot of ways to expand it, and that's going to be a big focus.
Yeah, and I think to that point, and it wraps back around to actually getting the deal done and what happens after the deal is done is, and it sounds so simple, but sometimes it's hard when you get lost up in the actual transaction itself, is to remember the importance of communication. Communicate. You can't communicate enough in getting the deal done or as it happens after, because as Steve is mentioning with respect to this ongoing enterprise of other investments that the PE firm is going to do, there's going to be a need for those to be like-minded clinically from a clinical perspective, and from an excellence standpoint, it never works well to kind of put the cats and the dogs in the cages together. So if you have people that are not aligned from a mission standpoint, that can become real important. And that's where the physician practices and leaders can have a real input, understanding that it is input and not control. And likewise, as the transaction is going along, the need to have constant communication, because it will be a complete another job of operations to get the transaction to cross the finish line in terms of work investment, time, effort, energy, and all of those things. So you can make your life a lot easier from that perspective. So those are some thoughts that we had about getting the deal across the finish line, and we appreciate you all being with us today.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Sydney. Always a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. Be sure to subscribe to our podcast so you'll be first in line to hear what's coming next. Don't want to wait for our next episode? Check us out at withum.com. That's WITHUM.com.